Let's talk about the best books I read in 2020. Because I read so many books in 2020, I'm going to be doing 3 separate videos for my best of series. This first video is just going to be my best general fiction of 2020. This includes pretty much any sort of genre other than comic books and graphic novels, which is going to be a separate video, as well as smut, which is going to be a separate video as well. 3 of my top 10 I read back in January of 2020, which is kind of sad because apparently it was just all downhill from there. So let's start off with number 10. And that is Ben Heavens by Daniel Kraus. So Ben Heavens is a YA horror about a girl whose father has gone missing. Her dad had led a very paranoid survivalist lifestyle before he went missing. Her father believes that he was abducted by aliens, and he spends his time before he goes missing trying to catch one of these aliens. After he goes missing, his daughter and her best friend decide to keep up these traps trying to catch these aliens that her father was trying to get. I enjoyed so much of what this book did. I don't think it was subtle, so if you're looking for subtle commentary, this isn't for you. This book had a lot to say on immigration and how we treat people that we don't quite understand. It does it in a very, very dark, graphic way, so if you are squeamish about violence, I would not pick this up. It definitely hits you over the head with that message, obviously, when you think about the fact that these are actual aliens in here. It's not exactly a subtle metaphor, but I think it worked really well. I also really like the dynamic between the main character and her best friend, because while you don't really understand why she is still friends with this guy, I kind of get it. I think that sometimes we all keep toxic friendships in our lives that we had since childhood. It just happens from convenience, from some sort of misplaced loyalty. And I kind of love the way they explored this toxic friendship. Her best friend is very much the type of guy who got picked on and bullied. And normally we are always made in media to feel bad for that type of character. But often in real life, those types of people end up with all of this anger and all of this rage. And they end up perpetuating this rage in ways that are completely not okay. And I love that this book explored that because I haven't seen that very often. I think another thing that girls in general have to deal with a lot is the idea that just because a guy is nice to them, that they then deserve their love. You know, women are so often told like, oh, he's such a nice guy and he does so much for you, as if that means that they have earned our love. It's such a gross concept. And I think this book kind of does a good job at showing that side of things too, in a very like small way. It's not like any huge portion of the book or anything. I also just related to the main character as someone who's dealt with grief in my own life. Watching her completely snap at one of her teachers, I was like, oh, I recognize myself so much here. I know a lot of people didn't like this main character, but I personally found the way that she was dealing with her grief very realistic, and I would definitely recommend this book if anything I just said sounds interesting to you. Number 9 on my list is The Hand on the Wall by Maureen Johnson. I read Truly Devious and The Vanishing Stair last year, and Truly Devious totally blew me away. I absolutely loved it, but The Vanishing Stair kind of let me down. I didn't love it nearly as much. I thought that there was something about the pacing and stuff that just really didn't work for me. So I kind of had given up hope on liking the conclusion to the series. I bought the first book as a hardcover because if I love a book, I usually want to own it, and therefore I usually want to own it in hardcover. I also bought the second book in hardcover before I read it, thinking that I was just gonna love it. So for the third book, I was like, I'm not doing that. I'm just buying it as an ebook. I know it's gonna disappoint me, and it's fine. Well, turns out I ended up loving it, and I had to buy it in hardcover anyways. So the Truly Devious series is a murder mystery at Ellingham Academy, where Stevie Bell goes to try and solve the crime of the century that took place at the school. Years and years ago, the dean's wife and child had gone missing, and the wife showed up murdered. No one knows what happened to the daughter because her body was never discovered. She's never come forward and said she's alive. So nobody knows what happened to her, nobody knows who murdered the mother. And Stevie Bell wants to come to this quirky school and solve this case. But then when she gets there, other murders start happening. So she obviously needs to solve that case too. I obviously can't talk a lot about what happens in this book or else it'll spoil things, but I will say that this almost turns into an Agatha Christie style murder mystery because while she's trying to solve the murders, the school kind of gets shut down, but then they all get snowed in and they end up stuck on the grounds of school. And so it ends up kind of that closed circle with everyone in the academy, her trying to solve it. And I just loved the vibes. It's not like I was sitting here thinking that this was mind-blowing or anything, but it just felt like coming home. It felt like a warm hug. I don't know how to explain it. I just loved it so much. And it actually convinced me in the end with her and her love interest, because I wasn't like overly fond of him. But in the end, I enjoyed them together. I did guess the big reveal, but I love the journey so much that that didn't take away from my enjoyment. I know that there actually is going to be another book, but it's going to be a standalone mystery, and I'll definitely be picking it up. Number 8 is Take It Back by Abdullah. So this is a legal thriller about a case involving 4 Muslim boys and a physically disabled girl. She claims that these 4 boys have raped her, and these 4 boys claim that she just wants attention, I believe. I can't remember. I did read this back in February, but I do remember loving it. It's from the perspective of this caseworker who's helping the female of the case get through her sexual assault. There's a lot to be said in this novel about prejudice, whether it's the prejudice in racial discrimination or for this woman who is physically disfigured. I believe this also takes place in high school from what I remember, so there's of course all of the general high school viciousness that you get when a case like this happens. I also thought that the main character was really interesting as well. I know this is a series, and I think that Abdullah did a really great job of creating a character that I want to follow in further books. The main character herself is Muslim, and she has a very fraught relationship with her family, who believe that she's forsaken some of their beliefs. The author does a really good job of making you guess all the way up until the end as to what actually happened. And I thought the book did a really good job of kind of showing both sides of this situation, of having to show what an accuser has to go through in a sexual assault case, as well as what the accused are going through based on racial perceptions alone. I personally think this did a lot better job at tackling sexual assault than The Night Swim did, despite the fact that The Night Swim is getting so much more hype. I'll definitely be picking up the next book in this series, and this has definitely made me excited to try more legal thrillers. Also, her writing, just in general, was so good. There were so many times where I would like underline a line, which I'm not someone who annotates. I want to start doing that with books that I love, but I was reading it on my phone and I would still like highlight things and be like, I need to come back to that, which is so rare for me. So I like to cheat in my list, where if I read like a couple books in a series, I will count them as one book for my best or worst ofs list. And that is what I'm doing here, which is 6 of Crows and Crooked Kingdom by Leigh Bardugo. These books probably need no introduction. They are talked about enough here on BookTube, but essentially they are heist novels while also being fantasy. I've mentioned it a couple times before on this channel, but I love a good heist movie. They are an absolute obsession of mine for some reason. I don't know why I love them. There's something about the like quirky cast of characters that come together to pull off this heist that I just adore. And I've never read heist books for some reason. It never even crossed my mind to until I picked up these books. Honestly, the more people talked about them, I just ignored them thinking that they were just fantasy. For some reason, the word heist never jumped out at me. But I ended up loving them more than I ever could have thought. I am absolutely obsessed with every single character in these novels. And that is really what it comes down to more than anything for me, is each of these characters is memorable. Each of these characters I enjoyed for one reason or another. Usually with a cast of characters, there's always 1 or 2 I don't give a crap about, or there's only one I'll like, and I only want to read their perspectives. But with these books, I literally got excited for every single character's perspective. I got excited to hear more about every single character's background, and that is a feat in itself. Another book I read back in January, No Exit by Taylor Adams. So this is a thriller that takes place at a rest stop, where our main character gets snowed in and stuck with these 3 or 4 strangers. I can't remember how many other people are there at this rest stop, but she's stuck with a couple strangers. While she's there, she realizes that there is a child locked in one of the cars that are at this restaurant. So she knows that somebody here must have kidnapped this child. This book was just so action-packed, so fast-paced. For a book that takes place in one night at one location, that seems impossible for it to be exciting from beginning to end, but it really was. The main character is so well developed. I loved her so much, and in a thriller, that's not really something I can always say. Normally you're rooting for the character because you're just simply rooting for the character to stay alive, because, you know, you don't normally root for a character to die unless they suck. But it's normally not so much that you actually like the character as much as you're just a good person and want the character to live. With this character, not only did I love her, but I loved her interactions with the little child here, which is another thing I normally don't love. Not a big children's person, but I especially can get annoyed if the child seems a little precocious and like wise for their age. But this writer pulled off the relationship between them flawlessly. I also really loved the villain in this. I think it's another difficult thing to do sometimes, to make a villain that seems fun, but not overly ridiculous, not overly cheesy. And I think that he did this really well. I loved the villain, and I loved the relationship with the villain and the main character. I thought it was just really, really fun. And overall, that's just what I would say about this book, is that it's a fun, it's a fun, action-filled ride. And make sure you have time, because you're going to want to read it in one sitting. The next book on my list, number 5, is The Death of Vivek by Akwaeke Emezi. I read the arc of this on NetGalley during the summer, and I just absolutely fell in love with it. I'd never read anything by Akwaeke Emezi before, but I definitely want to pick up more of their work. So this is very much a book about the life and death of Vivek. The book starts off with this character's body being found, and the book kind of takes you back to try and see how he died. But I think it also just did such a good job of showing how he lived, and really just who he was. And I feel like they did that by showing everybody's perspectives of him. The book takes you through the perspectives of different people who knew him and showed you Vivek through the eyes of the people who loved him. When you're talking about a character who died, I think that's such a beautiful way to talk about them. I think that the book did a beautiful job of talking about trauma, of talking about identity, of talking about a life worth living. I think it also showed too how even when people are doing their best to love you, they can still fail you. I thought the author did a very good job of making a very vivid setting as well. Every time I picked up the book, I just felt like I was there. And I thought the book just did a beautiful job of talking about grief, talking about truly knowing someone. This was definitely a standout book for me. Number 4 on my list is The Only Good Indians by Stephen Graham Jones. This is another book that I got off NetGalley during the summer and read the arc of. This book was so unexpected for me. At this point, I had only read one other Stephen Graham Jones book, and that was The Final Girl, and I really, really didn't like that. But after reading this book, I realized that that was just more the writing style that he chose for that book, because this book blew my mind. This is a horror book about 4 Indigenous men who did something they shouldn't have done back in the past and are now being haunted by it in the present. One thing I realized because of this book is that I very much enjoy entity-type horror novels. The horror in this book was just so different from anything I've really read, and I enjoyed it so much. The book does such a good job of kind of slowly ratcheting up the tension and the suspicion, and then just like out of nowhere, violence. It's gory and brutal, and I always love that. It's very much steeped in Indigenous culture, which I know, not being Indigenous, a lot of it, the cultural significance probably went over my head, but even what I was able to get from it, I just really, really enjoyed. That's another thing I realized that I really like in horror or in other books is some other cultural aspect, because as a white person, I don't have a lot of that. And I always find it so interesting to read about somebody else's culture. And especially how that affects them, how it affects their community. I think that's always really, really fascinating. I thought all of the characters in this were great. The only thing I would change about this book is I kind of wish that it went back and forth instead of being kind of split into 4 different sections. But that's kind of a nitpicky thing, because overall I just really, really enjoyed this. I truly do think that Stephen Graham Jones is just such a unique voice in horror. Book number 3 is The Space Between Worlds by Micaiah Johnson. This is another book that just blew my mind. I'm about to do a terrible job explaining with this, but stay with me. This book is about a world in which people can traverse to different Earths. But on each of those Earths are the same people, but different lives, based on different choices, different aspects, just small differences that make up big differences. I can't remember how many worlds there are, but there are hundreds and hundreds, and they kind of, the bigger the numbers get, the farther away from their world that world is. So if it's just world 2, then it's pretty much the same world as the one they're inhabiting. But if it's world 300, then it's a world that is completely different than the one they're on. They're the only ones that they know of that are able to traverse to these different planets. And they've started a corporation to be able to do this and bring home information from those worlds to, I guess, better their world. I can't really remember why they do this. Now the problem is you can only travel to these worlds if your doppelganger, essentially, is dead. The main character is one of the most in-demand travelers because she only has 7 doppelgangers left alive. It sounds really complicated when I explain it, but this book is under 300 pages and it does so much in that time. I love any sort of sci-fi that has this element of different universes or different timelines, different choices leading to big different outcomes. You know, anything that involves like the butterfly effect or something like that, I just love. And this was no different. The author did such an incredible job at, like I said, doing so much with so little. I've never seen an author who just went through so many ideas, so much plot in such a great way, in such a well-balanced way, in so few pages. They did so much and yet nothing ever felt rushed. I love what this had to say about trauma. I loved what this had to say about fate. It of course had discussions about social class as well. I loved how their world looked at sex work. That was great. As kind of these healing people who should be revered, not bastardized. I also highlighted a quote from this book that says, "I turn the idea over and wonder how long I've been letting my most wounded self make all of my decisions." And I was like, well, hot damn, that hit me to my core because we all do that. And like I said, I just love how this book talks about trauma and discusses how much that affects you and your life and your decisions afterwards. I'm admittedly crap at discussing sci-fi, but I very, very much loved this one. Number 2 is another instance of me putting 2 books in one slot, and that's In the Woods and the Likeness by Tana French. I don't have the first book here, but I do have the second one. The first book I read on ebook. This is a crime series written by Tana French called The Dublin Murder Squad. The first book is about a 12-year-old girl who is murdered, and this detective named Rob Ryan ends up seeing similarities to when one of his friends was kidnapped back when he was a child. The second book is about a girl who gets murdered and is carrying the idea of an alias of this main detective, Cassie Maddox. The thing I love about this series is that while there is a crime, and while these books are about the solving of that crime, is really their character studies of the detectives doing the solving. Tana French does such a good job of delving into the psyches of these characters. And even though you may not always like the characters, even though you may not always support the decisions they're making, it's still interesting no matter what. The first book was one of the most frustrating experiences I've ever had. I was literally screaming into a pillow at the one point because I was getting so frustrated by the main character, Rob. But as I went along, I kept realizing that even though I hated the decisions they were making, they rang true. They felt authentic, they felt like the decisions he would have made even if I wanted to slap him. What I will say is in the first book, and even in the second book a little bit, the answers are obvious. The mysteries are very solvable pretty quickly. But for me, that wasn't what it was about. It was about the characters themselves. The second book is about Cassie, who is Rob's partner in the first book, and she ends up going undercover to this house where the murdered girl used to live, because she suspects that one of her roommates is who killed her. This very much has a dark academia vibe, but dark academia if the students never actually went to class. I loved the very hazy summer night atmosphere that this book had. The friendships and relationships that she was able to develop were so enticing while also being completely inappropriate and kind of sinister. I love that each of the books in this series switches perspectives to a new cop, because that means that it's kind of no holds barred. Whenever you read a crime series, or really any series, you know that the main character can't die, for instance. You know that the main character can't really have anything too bad happen to them because they need to come back for the next book. I love that this series jumps from perspective to perspective, because that means that anything can happen. All these characters that you've just spent all this time delving into their mind, they could die by the end of the book. You don't know. And that's something I really, really love in a series, is when the author just has no limitations in what she can do. I can't wait to read more of this series. And now we're here. We're at number 1. Time to talk about my favorite book of 2020. Lo and Behold is one of the first books that I read in 2020. So nothing topped it throughout the rest of the year. And I can tell you right now that I have thought about this book every single week since I've read it. And that book is Know My Name by Chanel Miller. I never thought a nonfiction book would be my number 1 favorite book that I read in a year. I'm not really a nonfiction girl, and I'm especially not a memoir girl, but this book was so fucking incredible. This book is about Chanel Miller, who was sexually assaulted by Brock Turner in Stanford. It became a huge media case. It became a huge legal case, and there was a massive media frenzy surrounding it. And this is her memoir about what happened then and what happened after. I listened to this book on audiobook where Chanel Miller narrates it herself. And I definitely would suggest you do that if you decide to pick up this book. This book was so incredibly raw, so incredibly powerful. I can't imagine the shit she had to go through, but the way that she is able to write about it in such an unflinching way is remarkable. This literally starts the day that happened to her. The day that she was sexually assaulted by Brock Turner. And it continues in kind of a linear fashion from that night. She talks about every single thing that she had to go through because of what happened. Every terrible comment she had to read online. How she had to have her identity stripped away from her. The legal proceedings that essentially stopped her life for months afterwards. The way her relationships were affected, the way her work was affected. Just, it really talks about every single aspect. In such an honest, brutal detail. This is a book that I think every single person should read or listen to, because there's no way that you could ever come away from this book and think, well, why wouldn't she have come forward? Well, why wouldn't she have gone to the police? Because you see in vivid detail why girls don't want to be put through this. She also talks about how she really had the perfect case. She came from a good family, and she wasn't dressed provocatively. She wasn't a party girl. She had witnesses, are things that affect cases every day. And yet, even with everything being perfect for a slam dunk case, even with him being found guilty, he was only sentenced to 6 months in prison because her trauma wasn't worth as much as his future. This is the best media that I've ever seen about rape culture and about the way it affects girls, about what we're telling girls about their own worth. I've truly not stopped thinking about this. I plan to listen to it again this year and annotate it as I go through. And obviously this was an interesting case no matter what, but that didn't always mean that it would make a good book. But the thing that's obvious from this is Chanel Miller would have been a writer no matter what. If this hadn't happened to her, she might not have written this book, but she would have written something else, because she is an incredible writer. She strings words together beautifully and in a way that really punches you in the gut. I really cannot recommend this book enough. Even if you think you know about the way rape affects people, I definitely still think this is something worth listening to. Because it is definitely an emotional experience, but one that I highly suggest. And it is my favorite book of 2020. I hope you like this video, and I hope you'll come back again soon. Bye.